Hey, Sarah.
Hi.
I'm so glad that we are able to jump on and do this because I heard your podcast when you were with Jenny Blake, and right away I connected with you. I loved
Mm,
everything. I loved everything that you offered. And this was before I was even aware of who you were. There was such like it was genuine, but it was also super relatable,
mm,
which I loved. And so I reached out to you and here we are.
I love that. And I had a similar experience when I went to your website. I was like, ooh, I'd like to know you further. So I love that that happened that way.
So cool. So
Mhm.
we have so many things that we could talk about in regards to personal development, professional development, and we've narrowed it down to really focus in on inside at the
Mm,
end of the day. Just that everything, you hear often that it's an inside job, but just that everything is internal, which is a huge piece of what I've gotten from your book that's right behind me
mhm.
that we'll reference as well. And I do have to say, I often have authors on the show, and I'll always debut their book here. Your book seamlessly works with the whole vibe in here.
I love it. I was I had a very specific visual, intention for the book. So I'm so happy that it's suiting your vibe.
It looks so awesome. I just love it. So yeah, we're gonna be focusing a lot on internal, and for everybody listening and watching, we're gonna be focusing on how you can strengthen that really,
Mm,
and what to expect in some way, that challenges that might pop up when it comes to that, and the beautiful analogy that Sarah's going to share with you that we're going to keep you guessing in a second. We'll get to that. But before we even dive in there, I would love for you just to share how Zing Collaborative came to be.
Yeah, absolutely. So my background prior to starting Zing Collaborative was in the corporate world. And when I was working in the corporate world, I had an opportunity to do a lot of different things while I was there. So I was in a lot of different roles and some different departments and different divisions. But the thing that I always really enjoyed was working with team members and coaching team members, and that, both formal and informal aspect of coaching and mentoring and development. That was part of my job. So that was something that brought me a lot of passion. And then there were two specific things I would say that led to pivoting out of that context and into what I'm doing now. The first one was just getting really passionate about helping team members find the sweet spot of what they're good at and how they can best contribute and how they can use their strengths in service of something greater. And then I also started noticing a trend where oftentimes it's easy to hold team members to a pretty high bar for performance, but what I observe is in a lot of different companies, we don't always hold the leaders and managers to that same bar in terms of how they are doing as managers and leaders to help their team members thrive. So I got really passionate about that, and specifically passionate about how to support managers and leaders to be really effective in their roles. And so in 2013, decided to pivot out of the corporate space and start my business, Zing Collaborative.
I love the idea of going to the top, and
Mm-hmm.
because what I'm hearing too, and I'm wondering, this is slightly off, but we'll come back, is it's so easy when you're at a level playing field with a colleague to do the game of the blame game. And what just came to me, and I wonder if you could speak to this, if you've noticed this in your experience, is that oftentimes it could be out of fear that you're scared to go higher up to talk about what's, because there's many things that could come from that, instead of just staying here going back and forth, whether it's responsibility or whether it's job security. Did you notice that, or do you notice that at all?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things come to mind as you're talking. You mentioned going to the top, and I very firmly believe that leadership, culture, all of those things, they do start at the top. And I'm pretty relentless about that, to the fact that even to the extent that if a company reaches out to me and they want to hire me, if that is coming from somewhere in the middle of the organization and there isn't buy-in from the top level leaders, I actually will tell them upfront that I don't think they should hire me, because they're just not going to get the benefit if there's not that belief at the higher levels of the organization. So I totally agree with that. And I would say what I also observe is a lot of times there are things that we can do at whatever level we're at, where we actually do have more autonomy and more capability than sometimes we notice. So, I work with a lot of people, and I have worked with a lot of people over the years that are really frustrated with their managers or leaders or whatever it is. And it's like, my organization and my leaders and my manager and all these things can feel really frustrating. But I do believe that there's often a lot we can do within our sphere of influence. So, to build on what you're saying, Christy, how can we start small and not only go back and forth, with kind of the same complaints or the same frustrations, but how can we increase that sphere of influence such that we can look at, even if I can't change the whole culture within the whole organization, how can I maybe start with my team or manage up directly with my own manager, to start to have some of those conversations and maybe start, with some of those smaller ripples of change or impact.
Which is such a beautiful segue. So thank you, because what I was visualizing when you were saying sphere was expansion.
Yeah.
So to lead from that to, and it may be an easy flow to how you thought, you know what, I'm going to write expansive impact. What was the inspiration for that?
Well, thanks for that segue. I think really at the end of the day, my philosophy on leadership is this idea that we don't have to change who we are. And that's a big thing you probably have picked up on in the book. I spent a lot of years trying to change who I am as a leader. And I tried to suppress parts of, my own style and my own approach that are actually really a core part of me. And I try to do that to fit into this idea of how I thought leadership was supposed to be and feedback that I had gotten and all of these things. And over the years, what I've decided is we don't have to do that. We can grow and we can evolve, but really it's more about how do we become the most expansive version of who we are. So visually, I like to think about it as, we're standing here and we're just like expanding into all of the parts of ourselves. And sometimes that might mean, aiming low and left, where it's like we're aiming a little bit left of center so that we can come closer to the bullseye. Sometimes it's stretching into something that's maybe slightly uncomfortable, but it's all in service of, being authentically who we are, but being the biggest, most expansive version of that person.
Yes. And I'm hearing when you were saying low and left, and I kept hearing choice when you were saying, and
Yeah.
when which leads to a beautiful phrasing that I heard in your book too, which many people may have heard of, but it really resonated. The way the context you used was the conscious action,
Yeah.
right? And so to raise that conscious action comes from knowing yourself more inside, from internally truly knowing who you are versus externally being what you think you should be. So one
Absolutely.
thing that really connected me to you was the idea of strengthening that inner whisper
Hmm.
that we all have, which then leads to more conscious action. So even when we're faced with uncertainty, imposter syndrome, judgment, all of those may naturally decrease once we can really strengthen that inner whisper that kind of has its own beautiful nurturing grounding force. So can you just speak to how the importance of the inner whisper and maybe ways that people can begin to strengthen that?
Mm, absolutely. Yes. So I think the inner whisper I find very fascinating because I do believe we all have this, and sometimes it's louder. And I've talked over the years about the idea of when the inner whisper shouts. So sometimes it really does shout at us. And when I left my job in 2013, it was this instance of I had had this inner whisper and it had been present for several years, and I had gotten these little clues and little hints. And in the moment when I actually quit my job, it was like the inner whisper shouted. It was undeniable. It came out of my mouth in a way that I didn't even expect. It was like the inner whisper just exploded out of me and I wasn't even expecting it. So I think sometimes that happens where the inner whisper becomes abundantly clear, whether or not we're expecting it. That's one way that it expresses. And I think we all have this within us in our day-to-day lives and in our day-to-day leadership. And particularly in our current context, I think it can be really hard to hear our inner whisper because there's so much coming at us all the time. We have so many emails and bits of social media, and we have all these perspectives of other people. And I've been thinking a lot lately about how on social media, for example, it's this world in which we're subjected to everybody's hot take about everything, and they may or may not have actually spent time formulating a perspective. It's just like repost, repost, this is what I think, this is what we should do, this is what you should do. And so the inner whisper, I feel, can become sort of muddled with all this other stuff and other people's perspectives and other people's opinions. So I think first there's potentially benefit in just acknowledging that it's I would say it's harder than ever to hear our inner whisper. So the question then becomes, how can we create space for that, and how can we give ourselves some gentle practices so that we can give the inner whisper space, and so that we can learn to listen and we can learn to hear it. So for a lot of folks, that might just be quiet moments, and I don't believe it has to be meditation. It could be something as simple as the moment when we're sipping our coffee in the morning, or getting out of bed and taking 5 minutes just with ourselves before we open up any device or open up any floodgates of anything coming at us. Taking a few minutes to write down our thoughts in the morning before we allow anybody else's thoughts to come in. Taking a quiet walk around the block, whatever that might be. But how can we incorporate a few gentle practices such that we can get quiet enough to hear the inner whisper and give it some space? And I believe right now, because we have so much coming at us, it might not be instant that we can hear it, but at least we can start to um, create an opening through which it can emerge. So those are a couple of thoughts, and potential practices that we could use to tap into that place of the inner whisper.
Yes, there are two things that stood out to me from what you were saying. The first is yes to the social media. I mean, the algorithm is meant to have us be in echo chambers. So if someone's
Absolutely.
taking a hot take, and then you're going to hear more of the same. So it's
Yep.
going to make you, it's going to confuse, it's going to create confusion,
Mhm.
right? So there is something, so anybody who's listening or watching who has any spark or flame of rebelliousness with authority, know that you strengthening your inner whisper also allows you to buck the system in a very of service way, where you're in the space of, I'm going to think for myself. I talk to clients all the time about, if you have a love of being in control, for better or for worse, you are going to love this part of emotional intelligence where you're mindful, because you are literally saying to your mind, nope, I'm taking the reins back. So you're more in control. So it does help when people, oftentimes when people are like, wait a second, who's in control here? If there's anyone who's listening who likes to be in control, which I think we all do to some degree, if not a very high degree, strengthening your inner whisper is a huge step in that direction. And again, it's control of yourself. It's not control over others. So I wanted to highlight that. I also, when you were talking about the quieting, and it doesn't necessarily have to be meditation, one thing that I would love for you to give your response to this too is, I often find too, if people who are like, I'm not into meditation, or my life is too busy, they may be really interested or excited about visualizing or reflecting back on something. So even if you could say, did you recall a time when you listened to your intuition? What happened? And then they get excited because then they're telling a story and they're like, oh my gosh. Or when you didn't listen to it and you look back and you're like, damn it, I should have listened to it. Where did you feel it? So that
Mhm.
they can at least recognize again and get more comfortable with like, oh, I felt it here. Cool. So now you start realizing, I feel it in my heart, or I feel a little bit of like air on the back of my neck. So to go to Sarah's point, it doesn't necessarily have to be quiet, although that is highly recommended for obvious reasons. Combining the two works too. So any thoughts you have on that as well?
I love that. And I love the exercise that you're offering, remembering a time when. And I feel like for most people, especially the opposite, like remember a time when you didn't listen to your intuition, or you didn't listen to your inner whisper, and what happened. What do you
Mhm.
remember about that? And not from a place of judgment, but I feel like we all have those moments where we kick ourselves to say, if only I would have listened to my intuition. So I love the exercise that you're offering in terms of the look back, or the look ahead of what could be possible if we do that. I also just love, I wrote down when you're talking, I love what you said about what I wrote down was thinking for yourself is an act of rebellion. And if you want to buck the system, you can do that by thinking for yourself. And I just think that is so good. And especially these last few years, like this act of conscious resistance of thinking for ourselves. I feel like our world needs that so much right now. And we have so many people telling us what to think about so many different things. And, even the news and all these things, it's like, I love this idea of holding the conscious rebellion of like, you know what, I'm not gonna buy into that. I'm actually gonna pause. I'm gonna think for myself. I'm going to
Mhm.
listen to my inner whisper, and I'm going to do that as this act of kind of conscious resistance or this compassionate rebellion. So I just love the way you said that.
I love the compassionate rebellion, and it's making me think of two things. So one is I've gotten really into I did it for myself, but I use it with clients too, is personifying emotions or personifying values,
Mhm.
which makes it allows for play to come in. It's just there's such a playful piece. And you and I may have spoken about this when we did our pre-conversation before you came on as a guest. But did I talk to you about Jackie Leonardini, who's a soul coach? So she's awesome. She was on like last season, and she's based in California, and she and I were talking about how any sort of personal and professional development can be really grueling if you're really in it. And I always say, like, you have to gross yourself out to grow, because you have to have those
That's great.
moments of cringy, like, oh, this is kind of. And what she said, which I loved, was that when she was going through her certification for soul coaching, she was saying to her mentor, like, oh, Michael, this is so hard. Like, why is this so hard? And he just looked at her and he said, it's because you're abusing yourself instead of amusing yourself. And I was
So
like,
good.
that there's so much to that. So I started personifying. So when you were talking about that person that's like, whoa, what comes to me, which may help also be another strategy of that intuitive, is what part of you it's probably fear. So what
Mhm.
part of that fear is feeling the need to go outside of yourself and abandon yourself? And then we have all these different parts of ourselves. So what helps me and has helped many clients, friends, otherwise, is to internally imagine that part of yourself that's scared is like a kid. And the part of you that's like that fierce mama bear is taking that little kid by the hands. Like, you're not like almost like the social media or the news is like a stranger that's trying to
Mm,
take your kid. And you're like,
yeah.
nope, I got my kid's hand. And it's this beautiful way of protecting yourself and nourishing yourself and igniting that like fierceness that we all like. There is something about, you know, I'm having a moment with the word, but not active righteousness, but like, do you know what that word is? Not angry, not um it's something about like having righteousness, but from a place of being indignant for a reason, like having it be of
Mm,
service and advocating.
mm,
That's coming to mind too when you're saying that. And then the other two is that you and I talked about this, and we're not going to get too far into this because this could be a whole other conversation that we can have you back for. But when it comes to intaking, who are you listening to? And to get very, very selective on who you're listening to. Sarah and I spoke about this offline, just that it can get a little murky. And so if you're not paying, and if you're already in a space of fear, you're already vulnerable and more apt to just glom onto something that seems maybe more solid, and you don't know necessarily who that is. So there's a book that I was reading called It Didn't Start With You. It's about
mm,
uh, generational trauma. It's brilliant. It's so
mm,
eye-opening. It's really amazing. And there was a line in it where they said something along the lines of, a guru starts with themselves and shows you their system, and a teacher starts with, I want to say they said service, and shows you yourself.
mm,
And
mhm,
it's giving yourself back to you. It's not like,
mhm,
listen to me, I'm the one who has all the answers.
mm. I love that. That's so good. It's very that philosophy is very aligned with the kind of the spirit of coaching, in terms of helping people uncover the answers that they already have within them versus telling people what to do or how to do it. And I love that. And I love also what you said about when we are in that fear state and we go online or we go on social media or whatever it is, and the question that comes up for me as I listen to you say that is, what are we really looking for? So it's like, um when when we log on or we open up the news article or whatever it is, or we go on social media, what are we really looking for? Is it we're consciously doing it, we're just looking for some design inspiration on Instagram? Okay, fine, whatever. But if we're in that fear state, and we're going in looking for solace or looking for reassurance, it's like we're probably not going to find it. And all of the research on social media, and I would put, a lot of the modern day news mechanisms in this too, like it's been very intentionally designed to just keep us hooked, keep the fear going, keep that wiring firing. And it's like, are we really going to find what we're looking for? There was a book that I read a few months back, and it was a short, tiny little book. It was the book How to Break Up with Your Phone. And one practice that she had, which I thought was really good, was just, if you're going to pick up your phone, it sounds really obvious, but to pause first and ask yourself, what am I actually looking for on here, and what's the probability that I'm going to find it? And I thought that that was such a useful practice, particularly in this time when a lot of us are so tied into our phones, and we pick it up just because we're used to doing that.
Which is another compassionate rebellion. It's
Totally.
another
Yeah.
compassionate rebellion. It's like, and also, what are you avoiding when you're reaching for your phone?
Totally. Absolutely.
Right? Like and it's probably the same coin, different sides, but it's like the more that this is such a huge point, and it goes so much to what I found as an underlying theme in your book is this idea of go in first. And it's and again, you do it in such a beautiful, welcoming, respectful, there's like respect coming from, like, totally, there's no insulting, there's no I'm Sarah and I have all the answers and you're going to get, it's so respectful, it's so loving, and it's so, there's such strength in it. And it's an invitation for people to say, you know what, I am willing to do this, and I will do this. And I also wanted to highlight something that you and I spoke about, which also leads to your incredible analogy of the mirror, which I'm going to throw to you in a second, is this strength and sensitivity. You and I talked about that. We both are very sensitive people in different ways. It showed up in our worlds in different ways, the way that we handled it and almost protected it or abandoned it, and how by strengthening your inner voice, you're putting a conscious protection, not over to numb your sensitivity or to abandon your sensitivity, but to protect your sensitivity and to let it in and out in a way that is as conscious as possible. And that all comes with strengthening that internal, because the sensitivity piece, I feel like, is so essential right now. You and I spoke about if more leaders who were sensitive, whether they're closeted sensitives because it's not corporate, it's not corporate advocated, or empathetic or whatever it is, if they had tools on how to strengthen that, imagine if more empathetic, sensitive leaders were running the world. I mean, it's amazing. So I want to pass to you any thoughts you have on that. And then also to segue to the mirror analogy of taking a look at yourself as well.
Absolutely. Well, I love what you're saying about sensitivity and compassion, and this tie to showing up that way while also looking inward. And a metaphor I've been thinking about a lot lately is the metaphor of a tree, where, for me anyway, if what I find for myself is if I am not rooted in myself and I'm not anchored and I don't have my my trunk and my roots, it's possible for my compassion to show up as people pleasing or enabling, or what one of my colleagues has described as the accommodation equation, which I think is so useful, which is we accommodate the needs of others without also taking into account our own needs. So if I don't have my trunk, rooted, it's easy for me to do that, and I sort of float away. It's like the branches kind of just can float off the tree. Whereas if I am showing up in a way where I am grounded in myself, I am rooted, I am doing those practices we're talking about, I can do that and also be compassionate and kind and all of the things. And it's like the both and of being grounded and rooted and clear while also being kind and compassionate. So for me, I found that they both need to go together. And that rooting part for me goes along with looking inward. If I'm just if I'm just looking outward at the needs of everybody else, that can be a slippery slope versus I'm looking inward at how do I want to show up? What are my needs as well? Those get to be in the equation. And also, what are the needs of others? And I often talk about that as kind of the triple win of, in being in integrity to ourselves and to others and to the world around us, such that we can hold all the different parts of that.
That is so, I feel like that just needs like a period, like a verbal period.
I
It's
love it.
so beautifully said. And I love the trifecta of, by doing that for yourself, you're simultaneously doing it for others, and for others consciously on a smaller and bigger scale. And also without realizing it, you don't know who's paying attention. You have no
Absolutely.
idea who's paying attention. So there's something about checking in with yourself and showing up from that place of integrity. And also, if you could also speak to, and then we'll circle back to the mirror analogy, but if you could speak to, so when you're out of integrity, what are strategies that you have to encourage yourself to come back from a loving place versus from a critical, so self-compassion versus self-criticism, when you're human and you find yourself maybe falling into old habits of people pleasing?
Mhm.
What are some strategies that you use to bring yourself back in alignment?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I had an interesting reflection that I was thinking about over the last few months, which is two of the most difficult situations that I've navigated over the last 5 or so years. They were very different on paper, but there was one commonality between both of them, which was they were both situations where I had been operating in a way where I was sort of being in integrity to the other person over being in integrity to myself. So I was essentially accommodating a situation with a person, and in both cases, I attempted to realign that equation to also bring in, integrity of self to show up in a way that I could be true to myself while also, honoring the other person. And in both situations, the conversation and the situation went kind of badly. And what I realized was in those particular dynamics, those individuals weren't interested in the harmonious flow of that integrity. Like everything was hunky dory as long as they were able to operate how they wanted. And I was accommodating or people pleasing that essentially. But if I attempted to sort of show up and be true to myself and also true to them, that was no longer okay in the dynamic of the relationship. So I think, how do we get out of that, or how do we come back to center? For me, there's a big piece around energy, and you probably heard Jenny and I talk about this on her podcast, but this idea of clean versus dirty energy. So what I find for myself is that if I'm in integrity to myself and in integrity to others, the energy feels clean and it feels clear, and it flows both ways. And it's clear. It's like there's no weirdness in the space. And I find that if I'm not being in integrity to myself, there's often some bit of what I call dirty energy around. It might not even be obvious. It might be really subtle, but it's like there's something that doesn't quite feel right in the space. And sometimes it's hard to put language to, and it's hard to figure out what exactly is going on. But that's one sign for me: is does the energy feel clean and clear? And if yes, it's like, if yes, proceed. If not, is there a way to clean up that energy, or is there something that could be looked at?
That's
Um,
that's yeah, no, it's okay if we love dogs. So dogs bark. Dogs bark. Absolutely. So keep going, keep going.
A mail carrier, that's like his nemesis. And then so that's one thing. Is the energy clear? Is it clean? Another pattern that I have become aware of, which my partner Jake actually helped identify for me, is if I'm in that pattern of like people pleasing or accommodating, it's he described it as throwing kindling on a fire. So um, if I'm in that place, there's a way in which I almost perpetuate bad behavior of the other person, versus putting up a clean and clear boundary. So rather than just saying, you know what, that's not okay, or stepping back or having a clear boundary, sometimes I'll sort of like accommodate or be okay with it, or like tolerate bad behavior, in a way that he described as putting kindling on the fire. And uh, you know, we can look at ways that that might be showing up for us. So oftentimes in a relationship, the relationship is somehow being co-created, even if we don't know that that's the case. So, we have let's say a manager that we really have a hard time with, and we're like, oh, this relationship is just so toxic. Well, generally speaking, both people are contributing to the toxic nature of that relationship, even if they're not trying. So it's like, is there a way in which one person might be accidentally or unintentionally throwing kindling on the fire, and perpetuating the bad behavior? Or if there's a relationship where we don't talk to each other openly, are we actually perpetuating it by not having the conversation and we just stay silent, and then the relationship just continues? So anyway, so those are a couple things I think we can look at. Number one, is there dirty energy or just unclear energy? If so, what can we do to clean it up or remedy that? And then number two, are there any areas where we are intentionally or unintentionally throwing kindling on a fire that's eventually gonna, become a big dumpster fire, if we don't stop putting on the kindling.
So I love everything about this because I was literally writing down when you were saying that, like clean and clear energy, kindling, power differential. And then you said, for
Yeah.
example, when you have a manager, and I was like, oh my
Mm,
gosh, this is so,
mhm.
because it can get so tricky when really with it all comes down to a lot of times that fear of job security. So if
Yeah.
there's a power differential and your direct supervisor or manager, you can feel that they're bringing the dirty energy. It's like, ah, man. Then there's that resentment and blame, like you're forcing me to have to abandon myself so that I
Yeah,
keep my job. And so that can create that like kinky kind of, you're not clicked in,
absolutely.
right? So
Mhm.
I love that idea of getting clear and that contribution. That I just spoke to someone about that earlier this morning. It was one of the best reframe words I've ever heard, was taking the blame and replacing it with contribution. So instead of
Mhm.
like the blame game, which can go in circles, right? You just say, okay, how is everybody contributing? So everybody is contributing who's involved. They're contributing
Mhm.
to it. So we
Absolutely.
love contributing when it usually has a very positive connotation. We love the idea of contribution. Well, what about when things aren't going anywhere from toxic to not so great? Everybody's still contributing. So if, we're on a team and I see you fighting with Pam and I walk in the room and we're about to have a meeting and I'm like, I'm just going to pour more coffee. I'm still contributing to it by walking away and avoiding that confrontation, especially if it's a meeting where we're all involved. If it's just between you and Pam, it's
Yeah.
different,
Yeah.
but I love that. And from everything you're saying, Sarah, it goes back to being able to sense clean and clear energy. So if you're very sensitive, you might be at the other extreme where you can't sense whose is whose. If you're at the other extreme where maybe your sensitivity has been stifled for some reason, or you just came into the world not as sensitive, you may need a little bit more tenderizing to really get clear on even sensing it, which goes back to that inner whisper, being able to just sense what's yours and what's theirs, being able to understand it, knowing what it feels like when you are in clean and clear energy, when you're with a friend or a family member or a loved one, where you're like, you know what, I love this feel right now. Okay, that's clean and clear energy to me. All right, what do I feel like? Just pausing there and saying, what does that feel like? How do I know that was clean? Ooh, I did not like that. It was just with the gas station attendant, but I didn't like it. Go
Mhm.
neutral. Don't go, it doesn't have to
Absolutely.
be, or the cashier at the grocery store. I didn't like it. Okay, what was it about? Oh,
Mm.
okay. Well, and if I'm honest, I came in and I was feeling rushed, and that's my contribution. But just that paying attention with more low stakes situations, so that when the high stakes inevitably come up, and it has to do with your partner or it has to do with someone at work, you're already feeling, which is something else I wrote in, comfortable with the discomfort of sitting in it and not either mentally cutting and running or physically cutting and running.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. And I love everything you've said, thinking about the contribution, what am I contributing? I think that's so good, and it reminds me of a systems-based approach, which is, in any kind of system, whether it's a team or a family or a board or a committee or whatever it is, it's like everyone is contributing to how that system functions. And even if we're being silent, or even if we're stepping back, or even if we think we're just not saying anything, somehow that is contributing to the health of the system, how the system functions, how it operates as a whole. So I love that question of what is each person contributing and how can we look at that for ourselves. And I also really love your example of practicing noticing the energy in these lower stakes situations. I think that's really, really good. And I love what you're pointing to in terms of, different people falling on different ends of that. And I think for some folks, to your point, like I observe that they are actually bringing the dirty energy, but they might not have awareness of that. And maybe they're doing that by acting in a passive aggressive way. And so like that is contributing to the dirty energy in the space. What I also find on the other side is a lot of really sensitive people. It's like we take it on as our own thing. Like, what am I doing? Did I do something to upset this person? How can I make it better? Like we're like coaching ourselves and going deep and like how do I need to improve and all of these things. And that's useful to an extent, but sometimes it's like actually we didn't do anything. It's like this is about the system, or this is about in this case the way the other person is showing up. So I think there's this both and of like looking within and doing our own work and really thinking about what am I bringing to this situation, and is there anything that I can do to clean it up or create
Yes.
clarity, whatever it is, and like not taking on the whole burden of the whole situation if it's not ours to take on,
It's
entirely.
100%. And it reminds me so much of what you were talking about earlier with the phone. It's
Mm,
like, yes, it can be useful to coach yourself or ask, what are you reaching? What are you reaching in for? It's
mm-hmm,
just like, what are you reaching for the phone for? What are you hoping to get? So if you're
mm-hmm.
reaching in for, and you do know, and that's another reason to strengthen the inner whisper, which I do believe goes literally holding hands with self-compassion,
Yeah, yep.
because then you'll be able to be honest with yourself that you're human and it's so normal. And you'll be willing to listen to the inner whisper, because a lot of times the inner whisper is inconvenient or uncomfortable
Yes.
because it's telling you the truth and you're like, but you know it, like underneath you really do. So I love that idea of checking in with yourself and like you said, okay, what can I do? And pausing first to go, where is this coming from? Is this coming from a fear or a feeling wanting approval or not feeling loved or feeling like or is it coming from a place of I've checked in? Because chances are there's one step before that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Chances are there's, what would that be? What would be that one step before going straight to how can I help? What did I do wrong? What do you feel like the one step could be that could click us into alignment first to
Mm.
then start asking questions?
Yeah, I think it's presence, and
Mhm.
that maybe sounds overly simple, but what I observe is if we're in the place you just mentioned, fear, judgment, telling ourselves stories, running projections, making assumptions, whatever it is, we're not in the present moment. And so I, and again, it's a simple concept that's a lot, harder in practice than it is in theory. But if we come back to presence, just being in this present moment, we're not doing any of that other stuff, because that stuff is either forward focused or it's past focused, but it's not the right here and the right now. So what I would say is what can we do in those moments to come back to presence? Is it, take a breath? Is it feel our feet? Is it just pause? Is it, whatever it might be, allow a little bit of space before we speak. Okay, I'm in the present moment. Now, in the present moment, I can get curious about what's really happening here. But if we're running all those other stories in our head, it can be easy to to kind of get lost in those versus coming back to this moment and then checking in from here.
Absolutely. And presence is very underrated and overrated, right? It's
Yeah.
it's like it's always there as an invitation. It's again the idea of redefining, and I say again because we talked about blame and shifting that to contribution, redefining what it means to you, if and what it and why you're not doing it, and does it matter? And these are all questions that I do feel is helpful when you have someone else there to bounce it off of, whether it's a coach or whether it's a therapist or a loved one or confidant. And if it's a loved one or confidant, I always say, like, just preface, just say, hey, I don't want any advice. I just want to kind of throw this out to you so I could hear myself talk and then see if you could catch anything that you're noticing or whatever it is, but just to kind of give an idea of what you want ahead of time so that you can get clearer and it doesn't get foggier, right?
Yeah.
Because especially when it's a loved one, we can easily jump into, we want to help them. So we may want to fix it. But the
Absolutely.
presence thing is so big. I love that. And so I am going to ask for you to share about your mirror analogy to help people, which I do feel is intricately connected to presence. Can you just share the story behind it and how that came to be?
Yeah, absolutely. So, a big theme in the book is this idea of looking in the mirror versus looking out the window. And the idea in a nutshell is oftentimes we, something bothers us or we're feeling irritated or whatever it might be. And we're looking out the window at like, why is this person acting that way? Or why is my company doing this thing? Or why did our leaders decide to go through this acquisition? Or why is my neighbor so annoying or whatever it is where we're looking out the window at other people and what they're doing or not doing. And again, especially the last few years, we see this all over the place of like who people vote for and what people choose to do or not do. And it's like those people, like they they are the problem. And the idea is, instead of looking out the window, if we notice ourselves doing that, okay, fine, but then how can we pause and look in the mirror to consider, okay, what's going on for me right now? Like, what is my role in this? What can I learn about myself in this moment? Why is it that I'm so triggered by this thing? What is it within me that's maybe unhealed, or what part of myself is maybe more fragile, such that I actually have a real problem being with people who think differently than I do. So it's like, what do I need to reconcile within myself? What can I learn about myself? Um, and then ultimately, what action can I take? And sometimes that's an actual thing that we might do, and it's an act we might embark on, or sometimes it's just shifting our mindset to look at, okay, that person's not going to change, but how can I shift my thinking around this, or shift my relationship to this topic such that I can find peace within myself, regardless of what's happening out there, out the window.
And you and I spoke about it too, is the fact that when you do choose to look in the mirror first, you're simultaneously also looking out the window because you're
Mm-hmm.
shifting your perspective.
Yeah,
And you
absolutely.
actually get a bigger window. It's just,
Yes,
which
yes.
I think is something you say in the book, or
Mm,
maybe you said that I might have heard you say that, but it expands. It becomes like, instead of just a small little window, it's like a picture window now. And you're like, oh my
mm,
gosh, I never even saw that,
yeah.
which, when we were talking pre-interview, I think it's worth saying that we're like, and it probably would be a bathroom mirror and window, because that's where all the crap comes out. And that's where the mirror gets foggy and you get to, it's not that it's dirty. You and I talked about
Hmm.
that. It's just foggy. So you get to
Yeah,
choose to kind of wipe it out. And then at the same time, you turn around and your window is magically defogged. Like it
yeah,
just, it creates this beautiful uh, and funny and lighthearted analogy within the analogy. And so
yeah.
those are big questions to ask yourself, those questions when you look in the mirror. Do you have any advice or ways people can dip their toe in to even take one of those questions? Like, what's my role in this? I mean, it's like humble pie, which I feel like
Yeah.
that's necessary. It's the humility piece is huge, but just ways that people may be able to dip their toes in to sit with it and really
Absolutely.
answer. Yeah.
Yeah, one practice I really like is inspired from Byron Katie, and that's just asking, is it true? And can I be certain that it's true? So I find those two little questions to be so powerful. And if we ask ourselves that question or those couple questions, throughout our days, often just that alone, I think, can be life changing. Like, we get triggered by an email. This person's a jerk. Is it true? Yeah, they're definitely a jerk. Can I be certain that that's true? No, I guess I can't be certain. Maybe they just sent it off quickly and they're running between meetings, whatever it is. So these little moments, is it true? Can I be certain that it's true? That might be one that I would recommend starting with. Simple questions, but hugely powerful impact. Another that we could start with is there a way in which I'm making an assumption in this moment? So, um, you know, if we find ourselves speaking in generalizations about a person or groups of people, are there any assumptions at play? Well, all people who vote for this person are like this, or all people who do this are like this. Well, that's an assumption. We don't know that every single person in that group is this certain way. How might I be basing my words or my actions on an assumption versus, you know, curiosity? And then a third one I might offer is, how can we focus on being curious rather than being right? And again, this one is difficult in practice sometimes, but the idea that understanding is very different than agreement. And again, we see this out in our world all the time right now, right? We see something online, we don't agree with this person, and we cancel them, we unfollow them, whatever it is. And it's like, what if at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter if we agree or disagree? How instead could we come from a place of curiosity, ask questions, work to understand, and, you know, maybe we invite a new goal, which is I'm going to work to increase my understanding. I'm not actually going to seek to agree. And what could be, different or possible if we were to do that instead.
Oh my gosh. So for sure that listening does not equal agreement
Right.
is what I'm hearing,
Hmm.
which leads to presence, which is
Right.
for you to fully be present, you have to be listening. And to fully listen, you have to realize that you don't have, it's not, there isn't like this invisible contract you sign, like I'm going to listen to Sarah and it's going to force me into agreeing with her, so I'm going to resist that. It's like, no, I'm just going to understand her perspective a little bit more. My theory on that is that when there's very staunch hot topics, there is a little whisper of fear, not about the other person being right, not about you being wrong, that your idea can change, that your belief can
Yeah,
change. And there's so much behind that, because that goes
totally.
into, from where I look, that goes into like family and loyalty and the whole tribal thing. And then if you're not believing what you were brought up, and it's
Yes.
like, what? There's
Yes.
so much to it. So just baby steps of just realizing that it's understanding, and just understanding, and that's it. And the agreement, and you can still disagree. That's the cool thing too. You still can disagree. You'll just see Sarah possibly as more human than the face of whatever you're quote unquote against,
Yes.
you know?
Yes, I love that.
So
I love your
big,
theory on that too. And I think you're onto
big time.
something. Yeah, because if we're grounded in ourselves and we can be curious and we can be open to our mind changing and we can be open to other people's points of view. But I think you're absolutely right, and particularly with how much weight has been put behind these different beliefs, like in some ways it probably feels like a whole shift in identity if our
Totally.
belief might change. So I think it's a really, really interesting
Yeah.
theory, and oh man, that could be so juicy to unpack.
Oh my gosh. And it all, for whatever reason, it brings me to American History X with Edward
Mm-hmm.
Furlong, and to be completely honest, and Ed Norton. I didn't even get through the whole movie because I saw
Mm,
the first scene that was so just horribly, I guess it was realistic, but it was so graphic that I didn't get through the movie. However, I understand, I read enough about it. I started reading about it because I was, well, if I'm not going to
mm,
watch, I'll at least read it. And I love movies. So that was like a huge, for me to shut that off. But I was young, I was much younger. But it was about Ed Norton having this wake up from
mm,
being brainwashed about within Nazis,
mm.
and how he shifted. And so that's extreme. And at the same time, I do feel like there is that fear of disloyalty with family and where we
Yeah,
come from. And then
yeah,
if we really want to go, and then I'll close this one, is that if you're disloyal to your family, you'll be abandoned, and abandonment means death. Even if we don't
yeah.
realize it, like subconsciously, that's the fear. So there's so much to that. So we're going to reveal, or I should say, relieve all viewers from that idea, in the sense of it's simply just to understand.
Mhm. Yeah.
If you want to go down the theory land, like absolutely, but it's just to understand. And one thing that you said, that had to do with the email, I want to go
Mm,
back to this because it stood out to me. So speaking of loyalty, remaining loyal to yourself, not abandoning yourself, it's a yes and. It's just like you said. So you get the email, you get triggered by it. All of a sudden you are aware enough to pause and go, oh my gosh, it just got triggered by it, which automatically regulates yourself. Then you start being empathetic and saying, well, maybe this person had whatever happened in their life. So you can have perspective, if I'm hearing what you're saying, right, from what you've said, you can have perspective and still be within integrity. Just because you're having perspective for this person doesn't mean that now you're totally over the line with them and abandoning yourself for getting upset, because maybe what they said really wasn't okay. Yet you're empathizing with, we've all thrown an email or a text out that we're like, oh, I wish I saved it in a draft or whatever it was, and we sent it. So it's having that empathy of perspective while also still remaining true to yourself.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love the way you've said that. And I think about it as, we don't know what other people are carrying in their metaphorical backpacks. So the person who sent the email, they might have a whole lot of stuff, in their metaphorical backpack that we just aren't aware of. And so it's like, to your point, how can we have empathy for that, and have compassion and, give people the benefit of the doubt, whatever it is. And also, like you're saying, not abandon ourselves. And another practice that I like to use for that is the idea of holding neutral. So, you know, we hear a lot about the idea of assuming positive intent, and I think that's fine. And again, for really compassionate people, my observation for myself and others is sometimes we might go a little too far and we might really assume positive intent, and give people 1,000 chances, and maybe they have positive intent and maybe they actually don't. And it doesn't mean that we need to assume negative intent or ill intent or project some kind of idea of people's intentions, but I like to just practice holding neutral. So it's like, okay, we got the email. Like you said, the email landed a certain way. Okay, we got triggered. Then how can we just hold that as neutral? So this happened. I'm not going to attach a story to it. I'm not going to attach a story to the person's, intentions. I'm also not going to attach a story to my trigger. I know that that's a big one that I have to work on is, if I get triggered, like beating myself up for that. It's like, oh, why can't I be more enlightened? It's like, I'm a coach. Why do I still get triggered? Why can't I just be more enlightened and not have a trigger happen? And I was just reading something recently about the idea that being like having those triggers happen is a very natural part of the human experience, and the idea is not to stop having that happen, it's just to be able to move through it more quickly. So holding neutral, accepting things for the way they are, being in relationship to reality. Okay, here's the email, it's reality, but I'm not going to attach this like major story to the email, to the person, or to my own reaction around it.
Yes. And to your point, triggers have positive action. Triggers what had you create your business and write this book.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you weren't triggered at all, so I totally agree with you. Again, the more that you bringing it all home or listening to that inner whisper, you're able to discern
Yes.
between what you pick your battles, you pick your own
Yes.
inner battles of like, which one is like, this is an absolute no. And this one, oh, that's old patterning coming back up and I'm going to let that go. Okay. I need a little bit more work on that one. Internally listening to that inner whisper, you just start, you get to lean,
Yes.
which one it's going towards. I love you bringing that up because I feel like that is something that often gets misconstrued, that when I go through any sort of personal growth, whether it's professional or personal, I'm going to feel great all the time and
Totally.
I'm going to know how to handle it. And it's like, you may know how to handle it better. It's
Hmm.
exactly like you said, it's the shortness of the trigger. Some
Yes.
triggers may shift completely. And at the same
Hmm.
time, I do believe that the ones that are here to help us be of service will grow stronger. They won't go
Hmm.
away until we actually have agency and do something. So I love you saying that. I think that's
Hmm.
so spot on the money. Um, Let me see. I feel like I had one more connector that I'm going to save. I just want to check
Awesome.
with you. Is there anything else that's coming up that you're feeling like this conversation's making me think to share this with anyone who's listening? Just about, awakening that inner whisper to help with strengthening their integrity, their anchor.
Hmm. I really love that you use the word discernment. And I think, that that's such an awesome word. And I feel like, again, our world can use more discernment, and we as leaders can practice discernment if we're doing these things we're talking about. But to practice discernment, we have to give ourselves a little bit of space. We have to do what I call zooming up, which is like step back, pause, lift our head up, look up. It's really hard to practice discernment when we're just grinding it out and, full of intake all the time. And so I love your use of that word. And the question that comes up for me as I hear you say that is, for each of us, what do we need to do for ourselves such that we can practice discernment and hear the inner whisper? And, I love, I've heard Elizabeth Gilbert talk about the idea of practicing stewardship and friendship toward ourselves. And I love the way she talks about that. And so, the question that arises for me is, um, giving ourselves those gifts of the things we need, that's a way to practice friendship toward ourselves. And by doing that, we can hear the inner whisper, we can practice discernment, we can be curious, we can show up with others. But we have to give ourselves those little gifts first, such that we can show up in those ways.
Mm, absolutely. I love that. I've nothing to add. The only thing I'm going to add is from your book. I think that's so beautiful what you just said, the stewardship, the friendship. I love Elizabeth Gilbert too. I don't know anyone who doesn't. So that's, or I should say anyone who's going to be watching or listening to this.
Yeah.
And also anybody who feels like, oh, if I'm so friendly to myself, I'm going to let myself off the hook or slide. The best friends I have, and I'm guessing you too, they lovingly will bring things to your attention that may not be in the best interest for you.
Mhm.
So just have faith that your inner friendship, your inner stewardship will also do that. We'll also be like, yeah, we're going to kind of lean you this way a little bit instead of having you go that way. So I just want to bring this all home. So we were talking before about social media, picking up your phone, all that stuff. And there was a piece in your book that had to do with values. And you had questions in here of, when you're faced with difficult situations involving a misalignment of values, we might first consider what we can do about the situation. I love these questions because they have to do with our values. They also have to do with our intake, right? So let's stay with social media or news for that matter. I feel like they're so clear. So there's three, and one is, what are the things I can positively impact, influence, or change, even in some small way? Imagine if you asked yourself that before you went on social media to post something, or before you read the news. That's what you're doing right now is you're shifting our confirmation bias. Start looking for that. Like, I'm going to pick up the newspaper and I'm going to start looking at how I can positively impact or influence versus feeling overwhelmed by the news, right? The second is, what are the things that I don't agree with, but that I can accept? Beautiful. Again, that's discernment. And that's keeping your choosing which trigger to keep, right? That benefits. And then what, if anything, is on the list, or with what you're saying, what if anything is on the list that I can't change, and also that I can't accept? Even deeper discernment.
Yeah.
I think those three questions, if we asked ourselves that, even the first one, even just if you have time and really to unpack with those three questions, what a life changer at the beginning of the morning, if you have time with a coffee or a tea, or at the end of the night, before you go to bed, or with a glass of wine, or with a cup of like decaf coffee, or whatever you drink. But to ask yourself those three questions, how powerful. I love it. Love it. Let me just make sure this gets right in close here. So what specifically, is there any one bookseller that you want to highlight where they sell your book? Because I know you're big on independent booksellers where people can buy your book.
Thanks for asking. On my website, I have a list of all of the, not all, but most of the big places where it's available. So that link is zingcollaborative.com/book. And there are the links to Bookshop and Amazon and Target and all of the various places where you can get it. And then, the independent bookstores can order it through the main distributors as well. Thanks for asking.
Awesome. All right. And when people want to learn more about you, where's the best place for them to go?
Yeah, that would be my website. So it's just zingcollaborative.com, Zing. And if folks want to stay connected, I send out Friday Favorites, which is a weekly curation of reflections and resources and invitations and some of those types of questions that you highlighted from the book. And that's the same website, zingcollaborative.com/Friday Favorites. And it's free. It comes out each week on Friday mornings.
I love the Friday, because then it gives people the weekend to really let it expand with a little bit more room versus go into go mode.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what a lot of people say. They like it on Saturday mornings with coffee. So
Yes, 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 yes. Sarah,
Mhm.
thank you so much. This was such a fantastic conversation. And I so look forward to continue following all the work you're doing and to have you back on without a doubt.
Likewise, likewise. I know I feel like there's so much more that we could talk about. So I can't wait. And thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure. And yeah, just really appreciate the opportunity to connect today. So thank you.